Excellent. Welcome everyone. My name's Simon Feivel. I'm the chair of SIMNA, and just want to first acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. Pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also recognise that what we're experiencing right now, what we're experiencing with the pandemic across Australia, is something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people experienced long ago when whitefellas first arrived here in this country. So just acknowledging the wisdom of the lands that we are on and the experiences we're having now across this country. Thank you all for finding the time to join us today. It's quite exciting for us to be able to move, to be able to have a seminar like this. The topic of our seminar today is on thinking of engaging a social impact measurement consultant. Why, when, and how? SIMNA is a learning network, and the purpose of what we're doing today and what we're trying to do is to help everyone learn more about this quite important topic. I'd like to hand over to Des, who will introduce herself, and to Rick as well, who will facilitate this session. Des, I want to hand over to you now, please, from the SIMNA WA Organising Committee.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Simon. Being on Whadjuk Nation here in Western Australia, I'll just say Nala Cottage Noongarmort, Kayan Cottage Nijabudja. I recognize the Noongar people as the original custodians of this land, and we walk beside their elders, past, present, and emerging. During this time of pandemic and crises, I reflect on how many opportunities there are in Australia. So I'm grateful to be here with everyone today, and for this opportunity for people across the SIMNA organizing committees to connect. An event that we had originally planned to be for Western Australia has expanded greatly. So we're very excited and encouraged by that opportunity. Quickly before we start, just some housekeeping. You will notice you were on mute when you came in. So we're trying to keep people from talking over one another with so many people online. But we really want to encourage you to use the chat box to interact with each other in the panel. Going forward, your questions, if you can put them in the chat box, either to the panel as a whole or to individual panel members. Richard Dale from YMCA WA will be monitoring that, and we will be putting those in and posting those to the panel as we go. Also, the session is being recorded, which I think you would have got a notification for when you signed in. Before I hand over to the panel, just some brief thinking behind this event. I know a lot of organizations I've worked with and been a part of have at one point or another engaged a consultant around social impact measurement. Sometimes this was done more successfully than others, and it just kind of got a conversation started for how do you engage with the consultant in a way that will give you something you can use and implement that your organization is ready for, that kind of meets that level of rigor and usability that you need. So we thought we should probably throw that out to the experts, which is exactly who we have here today on our panel. So I will ask each of them in turn to introduce themselves, and I will start with Kylie, please.
Cool. Thank you. I'm sorry, Rick, I was muted by the host. Hi, everyone. My name is Kylie Hansen. I am a director of Impact Seed. So I've been in and around outcomes measurement mostly across community services originally, since about 2012. So I was originally at WACOS, so the Western Australian Council of Social Service, for those from other jurisdictions, leading the sector's response around a particular policy we had here in WA that was trying to shift the conversation and the practice in WA to outcomes-based procurement. So my initial role was actually working with the sector and with state government to respond to that process. And because outcomes measurement was a plank of that, you know, that was sort of my entry point, I guess, into thinking about outcomes. Back then, though, it was just kind of one of many things, I guess, that we did at WACOS. In 2013, we set up Impact Seed, which is focused on building an impact investment and social enterprise market within Western Australia. And obviously critical to both of those concepts is this idea of outcomes measurement. So I guess since about 2015, it's probably been about half of the kind of work that I do, maybe a little bit less than that. And my focus now, I mean, really, with Impact Seed should be in outcomes measurement or impact measurement in the context of impact investment. But I think just because of the you know, legacy of history and what I've done previously, I still spend quite a bit of time in looking at outcomes for community services organisations. So yeah, that's just a little bit about, I guess, me and my experience in this area and Impact Seed.
Would you like me to introduce myself now? Thanks, Des. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jen Ehlers from Social Ventures Australia. A little bit about me. My background is fairly entrepreneurial. I spent about 16 years in Vietnam. I moved over there and lived there for 6 years during the US embargo, and was involved in several greenfield startups there around renovations and interiors. Essentially, all of the businesses had a focus on training and creating employment opportunities for the Vietnamese at that time, coming out of spending a lot of the young Vietnamese there had trained in Russia. And so there was a lack of the sort of Western business sense that was needed. And so we spent a lot of time with a lot of young employees. Ended up with around 100 employees in one of the businesses, and we were involved in exporting globally. So I sold that business after 16 years and spent time doing a lot of work within the community and within my son's school, and then went back to uni to do an MBA where I did some of these social impact units, which was where I met Kylie, and started doing some sort of single shingle consulting in the not-for-profit sector, mainly in strategy and governance. So around when I completed my MBA, I joined EY, the advisory practice there, mainly working in organisational effectiveness, a lot of strategy and governance, a lot of work in large public sector transformations, as well as leading the Indigenous sector practice for the Perth office. And I was fortunate to be able to hire EY's first Aboriginal employee in the Perth office, and I'm very pleased to say that she is now with us at SVA as well. So our team in Perth with SVA, we're a fairly small team, but we do work very closely with the broader SVA and SVA consulting team, which is around 100 people. Our work's split fairly evenly 3 ways across corporate, government and not-for-profits. For example, our corporate work, we've done an outcomes management framework for Woodside, a community investment strategy for South 32, and many community partnership evaluations for BHP. Government, we work mainly Department of Communities, but also across transport, justice, health, and then of course with a wide range of NFPs. So I'll hand over to Aden now.
Hi everybody. I've had a very circuitous career, and I'll spare all the details. But suffice to say, I reject being an expert in anything. And if my career has virtue, it's in the unexpected virtue of ignorance, I think. Where I've found myself working somehow is in arts, media, and social impact. So not social impact assessment measurement specifically, though that's a reasonably large chunk of the work. When I talk about arts, culture and media, things like ABC, theatre companies, visual arts organisations, universities, family foundations, all sorts of organisations that cross over with the arts and cultural sector. I don't want to be the sector nerd, and where probably most people listening here aren't from arts and culture organisations. So I was trying to think about how to kind of broaden that out. And I think, to give an example, what's unique about art in the context of social impact assessment is if you're evaluating the outcomes for, say, a service delivery program, say something like you're providing education, technical education to reduce the risk of homelessness. Although those programs are very complex and they produce their outcomes in complicated ways, there's a pretty common shared understanding as to what you're trying to do. You know, you probably want some measurable educational outcomes, skills developed. You probably want to reduce the risk of homelessness and have some measure of that. But when it comes to arts and cultural activities, you and I can both be looking at the same painting and have completely opposite interpretations, and that's still fine. That's still an acceptable outcome. So I think what I've been drawn to in the arts and social impact space is that the impact of art is always subjective. So I'm really interested in forms of social impact assessment that honour objectivity, honour local context, may not sort of spread across time, may not be replicable. So a lot of the work I do in social impact assessment in the arts is therefore ends up drawing on social sciences and participatory research. So that's a little bit about my background, and I think it's now back to Des.
Yes.
Taking a
awesome. Yeah, thank you all. I was having some mute issues myself. As you can see from our panel, we have varying levels of experience who I think will be able to contribute greatly to this conversation. Just a reminder before I go to the first pre-selected question, please send questions through the chat. It has been rather quiet. If you don't want to send it to everyone, send your question to SIMNA host, and then we can see them there. So moving on to the first question, we have two questions we've pre-selected for the panel. This one I'll address to each of the panel members in turn. So what are your most common reasons you've been engaged around social impact measurement as a consultant? For example, has it been one-off specific projects, ongoing work, framework development, etc.? If we could start with Jen. Who is still on mute. I think when you mute yourselves, the host has to unmute you. So Rick, maybe you could.
I'm off mute now. Okay, thanks. I think essentially the two key questions we have from our clients and what our clients are wanting is, how do we know we're achieving our mission, and how can we amplify or how can we increase that impact? As I mentioned before, Department of Communities are probably one of our biggest clients, and I think I'll refer to an example from some work we've done recently for them, which was around developing the outcomes framework and a formative evaluation plan for their local communities coordination project. This is, as we know, 85% of government money in general is spent on the crisis end of the spectrum here in WA, and it's very much program driven, not person driven. So this was a great project based on a UK program around focusing on the person, getting in early and avoiding a government program. In fact, it was one of the UK taglines for this was "Get a life, not a program." So, you know, it comes back to the lovely old lady who goes to visit her doctor every week. She doesn't really need to be seeing the doctor. She just wants to have a chat. So it's getting in and getting within the community and finding programs that people can, well, not programs, more community activities that people can be involved in before they get to that need of where they actually have to have that intervention of a program. So our work here with them was to develop the outcomes framework. We worked very closely with the department for them to get an understanding of whether this prototype was working and whether they'd have the opportunity to continue with it. So fairly standard outcomes framework development project, and then we went on to work with them on developing their evaluation plan. That's probably the the most common type of work that we're doing at the moment in our Perth office. And I'll hand to someone else to speak about what they're doing.
Yeah, so same question. Could we jump to Aden, please?
Aden on mute.
So for me, social impact assessment work is always entangled with communications, funding, strategy, research, sometimes sense making. And it's always approached with a degree of skepticism as well. Arts and culture organisations, it's often very funding pressure driven. It's like, we need this money, and the people giving us money have told us that we need something called a theory of change. And you, as someone who knows what that means, please help me. That's one end of the spectrum. And I kind of call that that's the expertise end of the spectrum. We have some kind of expertise. So for example, documentary film company needed to access the Documentary Australia Foundation, who provide deductible gift recipient status to documentary filmmakers who operate as sort of a pseudo social enterprise. And the Documentary Australia Foundation needed just this kind of typical social impact stuff that we've all heard about. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end with the arts and culture stuff, and it gets to the subjectivity bit, is when they don't know what's going on. And my job is just to kind of go in there and speak to people and figure out what the impact of something is. And that seems common in the arts and culture sector, the idea of like, we know this is valuable because it's art and it's intrinsically important, but we don't have a narrative around it. We don't have language around it. So can you go away and find out for us? So I like those two, because the first one is like, you're an expert, help us with your expertise. The second one is, you're ignorant, use your ignorance to go and ask a load of questions and figure out the model from the ground up. Yeah, I think that about covers it off for me.
That's great. I really like that piece, Aden, around your ignorance. So now use your ignorance, you know, to kind of help further the project. I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it. I think a lot of the work, similarly as to what Jen and Aden have spoken to, from our perspective is usually the same. So this idea of organisations that need something to support a funding application or require an outcomes framework to be put in place because of a project or service. Oftentimes, from my perspective, it is the creation of outcomes frameworks. I have done a little bit more recently in terms of, how do I describe it? It's kind of like a couple of organisations have wanted to peel off, you know, due to budget and other resource constraints, a question of attribution. So I'm doing a little piece of work with an organisation, or with a collective impact project here in WA called Imagine Futures in the southwest sort of metro area of Perth. And so they actually want to understand, well, what impact has the way in which we operate actually had in terms of the achievement of their outcomes. So it's not even looking at, okay, well, what outcomes have been achieved or any of that kind of stuff. It's like kind of a little sliver and trying to understand that attribution there. So that's really interesting. And it's actually been quite challenging to kind of scope out and figure out how we get to that. But it's just, I guess, an example of one of those pieces where it's like, get someone in who is independent and can kind of make an assessment on that. In terms of the structure one, an example that I'd have that I went to quite recently was complicated in terms of who the client was, but with the WA Council of Social Service, with Department of Premier and Cabinet, Department of Finance and Treasury here in WA, so holy trinity of government departments, looking at what many of you in other jurisdictions will also have, a whole of sector outcomes measurement framework. So that involved not only thinking about the outcomes and indicators, but looking to what the engagement process is. So I wouldn't say we co-designed those outcomes, but I'd say we collaboratively designed those outcomes, so that actually government colleagues and sector colleagues across WA are coming together to kind of frame that as we go. So that's just another example of, I guess, a more systems level piece of work that we've been looking at recently.
Thanks, Kylie. We have a number of questions from the audience. Thanks very much for sending those in. I'm just going to work through them in the order that they have come in. So first question is for Aden. Wondering whether you have experience in social impact measurement in design services, specifically architectural services, do you know of any work being done in this sector?
So I saw that and I had time to prepare, and the honest answer is still no. I've got no clue how you would do that. The closest I've come to that is I did a bit of work with the Fremantle Biennale, which is a major every 2-year arts festival in Fremantle, and that festival intersects with the built environment. So we had a couple of conversations around doing things like heat mapping to measure where people were going and that, but it was costly and a bit pie in the sky. So the short answer is no. I think it'd be really interesting, and I think built environment as art certainly has an impact. Yeah, I won't say too much more because that'll just be my ignorance speaking.
Thanks, Aden. Next question. This is for any of the panelists. So whoever would like it, please jump straight in. Can any of the panelists think of any great examples of the impact of their assessments on, for example, modifying service delivery, changing policy, expanding scale, etc.? Yeah, Kylie, are you able to unmute yourself? We're having trouble with the mute today. You can't, okay. It seems that when new people join, it changes the mute.
Yeah, you're in control, Rick.
There we go, okay.
The muting. Yeah, I think certainly in the more systemic work that I have been doing, there's definitely been a translation into policy and into actually seeing shifts being made. The outcomes framework in particular is still such early stages, and it's not, you know, kind of with WACOS anymore. It's been taken back into the Department of Finance to progress the second phase of it. But already we've seen different departments actually using those outcomes when they're starting to think about how they go to procurement, which I think is a good outcome from having consistent outcomes and, you know, having a common language across the sector. Another one I can think of, which I'm not actually sure if I can speak to, but it was a corporate investment review. And so the recommendations from that then informed the next phase of investment by that corporate. So that was another good example of that happening.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kylie. Jen, you have something?
No, I was actually just reading down the questions. I was going to go to the next question.
No worries. Aden, did you want to comment on that one?
I'll just quickly add as well. I think the highest impact project I've been very privileged to be a part of was working on doing a review of music education nationwide with the Family Foundation in Sydney. And I agree, when people come on board and it's big systemic ambition that and there's buy-in, that seems to be where there's a big impact. But that said, when I say there's a big impact, what I'm saying is I think we've done a really interesting report and I hope it's useful. But whether or not there's impact, I don't know, it'll be 10 or 15 years before we could say there is. And that's the hard thing with this sort of work, is you're very upstream from it.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How common do you see theory of change mapped across to outcome or impact evaluation in practice?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Thanks, Rick. It's obviously something we do a lot of, and we do see that it's actually moving. We do see the impact in practice. So I think one of the biggest things when we work with government is often they've already done part of this. You know, we'll go in and they will have what they see as their theory of change, and then we'll work with them to review that. And then throughout the project, we'll see where they have actually maybe pivoted in their thinking and changed the way, even sometimes the end result is going to be slightly different. So even the impact that they perhaps thought they were going to create in the beginning can sometimes absolutely change from when we've really worked through step by step through that program logic. And I'll give an example of that this wasn't a government example, one of the corporates we worked with recently, where quite a lot of funding was given in a mining town for an arts organisation. And it was when we were brought in to do the evaluation that as to whether that funding should continue, it was Sorry, is there a bit of feedback there? I'm getting some feedback. When we were brought in to see whether that funding should actually continue, it was at that point they realised that there wasn't actually any understanding of what the outcomes that they'd hoped to achieve with the funding was. So we had to go right back to the beginning, work through what it was they were hoping to achieve for the town with this funding. And so the overall impact, they were all totally unintended consequences. It was good impact, it was amplified through the process, and so it was it was a successful outcome in the end. But we do see it used right the way through, and I'm really confident in the use of this and making sure that we follow it through with our organisations.
Great, thanks, Jen. Aden or Kylie, either want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can make a brief comment. I think part of it is actually the approach and strategy that the consultant takes to it as well. So I quite like to have a program logic theory of change underpinning the work that I do. And I think when we look at tools, methodologies, and particularly, you know, around impact investment internationally, most investors will retain that kind of, you know, inputs, activities, outputs, short, medium, long-term outcomes. So, yeah, I think the extent to which it does draw across into evaluation practically probably partly depends on who you've got doing it and if they like to take that kind of strong theory of change or program logic type approach.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next question. This one is another bit of a tricky one. Similar to the question about, whoops, hang on. Lisa, can we take that off, please? Oh, thanks. So similar to the question about impact measurement in architectural services, a question about social impact measurement in employment services. Is it as simple as measuring the number of people removed from welfare support, or should it be more granular than that? Any takers?
I'm happy to go if no one else will. Always happy to give it a crack. No, I think there's a lot more. I think we know that employment for individuals not only impacts on, you know, what kind of welfare support that they might receive, but also, you know, mental health, ability to, you know, have a home and, you know, maintain a home. So I think that from an impact perspective, there's a lot more than just, you know, getting people off welfare payments and into work so the state's not paying, because I think there's a number of other areas that draw into that. So I don't know if the question was that simple, but that's what I would contribute to that.
Thank you. Aden.
Yeah, I'll add as well, and kind of echoing Kylie's comment from the last one. This is where, I mean, I'm one of those people where theory of change and logic model gets done all the time, because that's where you connect all of these sorts of things together in a way that kind of makes sense and gets everyone on the same page as to an idea about how the program operates. And the second kind of broader epistemic point I'd make is that the map is not the terrain. And I think if you're working in social impact assessment, you always need to remember that. The simpler your measurement system, the more likely it is to sort of misrepresent reality. You're missing out potentially on very important program impacts that, you know, might be considered ancillary, but might be really important and quite functional. So that's, I mean, the challenge you have is like, how high a resolution picture do you want, right? Too high resolution is too taxing and it's trying to do too much. Too low resolution isn't saying enough. So yeah, but at least from the question, it sounds like you'd certainly want a couple more measures than that. Yeah.
Yeah, I might add on to that too, Aden. I mean, there's always that sort of dilemma between the quality of the information that you're collecting and the quantity of the information you're collecting. If you try and make it, you know, if there's too much data to collect and it's too difficult, you run the risk of not getting the data that you need. And we tend to find that the simpler and the more frequent it is, the more easy it is to act on.
Thank you. We have time for one more and perhaps two, depending on how much response we have. So again, to any of the panelists, do you have any project experience in the environmental space? None for Jen?
None from us.
A very little bit. So from our perspective, it's obviously a really critical area for looking at impact investment and environmental measures. So, like in the regenerative agriculture space, we're starting to do a little bit more work, carbon farming, so renewable energy, so a little bit, but I would probably say that others on my team are more the domain experts in that area than I am, but I'd always be willing to try additional questions if any are there.
No worries, thank you. Aden?
No, I mean, it's almost a separate field. They've got their own people that study their own degrees for that sort of thing. It's more specialist engineering kind of knowledge than, the kind of things that I think a lot of us do.
Sure.
When it intersects with some of our issues, sure, but as a straight environmental piece, that's not some of the work that we would do.
I have a couple more questions here, but looking at our schedule, the questions are going to take longer than 2 minutes to answer, I know. They're really good questions. So I'm going to save them for the next bracket of audience questions. And I think at this point, I'll hand back to you, Des, and we could do the second set question to the panel, please.
Yes, awesome. This is the last and the second predetermined question that'll be posed to each of the panel members. So what are your top recommendations of how to engage a consultant, or what should you avoid when engaging a consultant in order to get the most useful work in terms of your social impact measurement? So if we could start with maybe Kylie this time.
Sure. I prepared for this one too. So I have 5 points I want to make, and I'll do it quickly. So I think in knowing what you want, there's a distinction to be made between clarity and certainty. So having people coming to me with certainty of what they want and not a lot of clarity is very challenging. And so having clarity but kind of a lower level of certainty is quite useful, because then you can kind of work through and be a bit dynamic in terms of properly unpacking like what it is that you actually need. I think outcomes measurement is so highly contextual, and so the more that there can be a little bit of dynamism, yeah, that word, a back and forth in terms of what actually is needed and required. I think that that's really useful when trying to contract a consultant. And I think it links because, I think you have specialist and generalist types of consultants in this area, and then you have kind of more academic and more practitioner ones. And I know that for me, I'm certainly more generalist and practitioner. So I kind of describe myself as methodologically agnostic. So I don't really draw on any particular kinds of tools and frameworks, but try to pull in the principles and stuff that's useful based on the context that I'm operating in. But if you're working on a project that actually needs a much higher level, like university level of rigor, like I'm not your person, right? So being clear on what level that you need and whether it's something more for a practitioner, I want to prove my practice stuff, or whether it's something else is really important. Thought to internal capability building and allocating resources for that. So I think I can be a bit of a pest when I work with organizations, because I always want to know who it is that I'm going to be helping, work with and build their capacity. So when I walk away, you guys are still able to do this and not contract someone else in again. And I think that is sometimes not what people are thinking when they come to us. They're like, hey, I just want to get you to come and do the thing and I won't have to worry about it anymore. And I think that really thinking through about how we can build capability of organizations is critical, because we can't just have this as a consultant-led industry. Being clear about budget upfront. Yeah, I can work within small budgets, but if I do not know that the budget is limited, that's really challenging to work with as well. And finally, just making sure you get more than one quote, because at the end of the day, I don't think it's about the dollars necessarily. Obviously, that's an element of it, but finding like the right approach of the person and looking under the hood as to the kind of approach that they take, I think is also really important, because, just like people are people, and, I don't like every flavor of ice cream. So, everyone's got a different way of doing things. So understanding what that is and how it gels with your organization is important.
Thanks, Carl. Whoops, sorry, Des, that's you.
Happy for you to take it, Rick. If we can move to Jen, please.
Yeah, thanks, Kylie. I'm building on what Kylie said. I think finding going to the organisation, it's so important to have that cultural fit. And when you're working with a consultant, you do work quite intimately and very closely with that person. So it's really important that you do your homework and you make sure they're the right person for you. I probably look for 4 main things. One is reputation. So is this person a safe pair of hands, the trusted advisor that you're looking for? Are they already your go-to person? Is it the sort of person that you would feel comfortable just picking up the phone and asking a question or having a chat to at any time around your business? The other one is obviously experience. What do they bring to the table in your particular problem or the area that you're looking at? And what does their broader organisation contribute? As Kylie said, if you're looking for something that's, needs a really rigorous evaluation, or you might need an academic, if that organisation doesn't have that capability, will they be able to partner with someone to bring that in? Or, what is the best way of going about that? The other one is that they are a good problem solver. They need to have excellent analytical skills and be able to rapidly synthesize information. Otherwise, you are paying for time, and time in consulting, time's money. So you need someone who's good at that, is used to doing it well and fast. You also need, I think, and this is the most important for me when I'm choosing a consultant for whatever needs, is that they are a good listener. Quite often you'll find people that a consultant has a product or a service or their particular framework, and they will shoehorn whatever it is into that framework. So I think it's really important that the person you hire is a good listener and they're assuming a need, not just trying to search for a fit in what you're looking for. And as someone employing a consultant, I'd say really make the most of having those fresh eyes in your organisation, because all of us have that same problem where we're so busy working in our organisation we don't get to work on it, and the consultant really brings in those fresh eyes. And I think that's probably it from me. Aden, did you want to add to that?
I will try with some difficulty. I guess to kind of frame it, I think a lot of what Jen was alluding to there, if I can infer, was a lot of it's about trust. How can I know that this person is going to be able to deliver value to my organization? And I think trust is important because there's an inherent imbalance, power imbalance in consultancy. Because if a consultant's being approached, it usually means the organization is in some way stuck. And that there is this person who is presumed to have some kind of knowledge or expertise. And also that expertise has some kind of objective quality, like, oh, we're in the organization where it's too close to us, we're too in it, we need someone who's objective. As I kind of alluded to before, and I think as has been alluded to, the objectivity thing is sort of a bit of a fiction anyway, because a lot of consultants do bring a strong sense of subjectivity to it. My view, particularly working in the arts, is I do less of what I do is aspiring to be objective than it is knowing my subjectivity in such a way that I can kind of course correct for it. So that's how I think about the kind of the power imbalance element. And I think that need for someone objective, I mean, it's such a problem in the public sector where you'll have senior managers, they kind of know what they want, but it's almost like they need to buy this sort of objective verification. So they'll get one of the big consultancies in to come in and reach an outcome that the people in the organization sort of wanted from the get-go, just to kind of provide that external authority. So yeah, that's what, all of that is to say that's why trust matters, because if you were seeking a consultant, in a sense, you were stuck and you are in the low power end of the relationship, and people can and will use that to exploit you. The second element of that is, like, as a consultant, I guess my view is it's my job to provide value, not to hit the brief. And I think so much of the unethical work that goes on in consulting, and not social consulting so much, but so much of the unethical work that goes on in consulting is because consultants hide behind, it's what the client wants, it's what the brief was. But if you're sitting there as a consultant and you're like, this brief isn't actually solving the problem, the real problem is this, you have to be willing to have that conversation and shift from the brief to what is going to provide value for the broader problem that they may not articulate or have articulated or have clarity around. Yeah, so I think a lot about the big word there is trust. And the second big word is someone who will just provide value. And that's it from me. Over to you, SIMNA.
Awesome, Rick. I think we're going to go back to questions from the audience now.
All right, and thank you. I have a stack of them. And so I just want to say up front, if we don't get to yours, I'm sorry. But most of them are questions to everyone. And so if we don't get through them all in this session, we will have a record of the chat, and it may be that Aden, Kylie and Jen would be happy to provide some answers. Where will we get those? I guess where we're going to have the recording, perhaps. I'm not sure. Anyway, we'll find a solution. Okay, let's go to some more questions. Interested in how to connect impact measures with public value. For example, with community adult education services which provide life skills, pre-vocational learning and engagement, which could show the public value to government of this sector.
Kylie, that's one for you.
Sure. So I think there's a few different ways that could be gotten at, and without going into a whole thing about it. So I also sit on the board of LinkQuest here in WA, which is the peak body for community centres, a lot of which do provide kind of some of those sorts of things. There's some methodologies that can be used. So I know that a lot of the centres were using results-based accountability, RBA, for some time. But I think really it's about, and again, if I go back to the approach I would use, having a strong program logic theory of change, seeing what the outcomes are, working those backwards, what are the indicators, and then obviously then pulling in, linking with one of the other questions, what's the value of being able to have people creating, the learning and engagement to help them get into employment, if that's what it is, or get into further education. So in that sort of space, there's a variety of indicators that can be pulled down to use. We could be applying financial proxies to that if we wanted to. I don't know if that's a debate we want to get into around the use of financial proxies, but there's some challenges with that. And I don't know if S. Howard is in WA, but looking at how I live my life is actually one of the key outcomes within the WA outcomes measurement framework. And so actually, I probably can't share it at the moment, but when it is a little bit more developed, pulling that down, there's a set of indicators underneath that have been agreed to across the state government departments, and being able to map up to those would be really interesting, and I think demonstrate, at least at a state government level, a connection of that program to meeting those broader state government kind of priorities and targets. That's, a broad kind of, there's many dimensions we could delve into, but at a high level, there's a couple of thoughts on that one.
Thank you. Jen or Aden, anything to add?
No, not to that one. Thanks, Rick.
Okay. There's a question from Janice about what work should a not-for-profit do themselves before engaging an impact specialist. I think a lot of that was covered in the answer to the second set question. So I'm going to move on.
Can I just add to that one, that make sure
Yes.
they have all their data and all their materials ready. It's something that often will, when we'll go in, we'll find out that that's one of the biggest issues that delays projects. And as we always say, time is money. So all of the information, if they have everything that they want us to know, that they have it ready in a format that's ready to go, because that's something that is constantly delaying projects. And I'm sure Aden and Kylie will have found that as well.
I will just add as well, the Centre for Social Impact has a resource called The Compass, which is, it's a big PDF, but it's a great little primer on what social impact assessment is. So if you have zero background in this, that's a great thing to read. And the Centre for Social Impact also runs with Katrina Stratton, who's also on the SIMNA WA committee, these outcomes measurements workshops. So there's an element of the work you should do is probably deciding if you want a specialist at all, because you may be able to get a lot of legwork out of publicly available information and workshops that are out there.
Great, thank you. A question for Kylie following on from what you said before about the state outcomes framework. Where will the responsibility and accountability for outcomes sit once NGOs, for example, have been contracted to deliver services? And what does that imply for social impact consultancy?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Michael. I think, so in terms of the outcomes framework, it hasn't been decided, so that'll be part of, you know, what's worked through with Department of Finance now. Personally, I think, so there's actually recently a consultation that DSS has done around looking at outcomes measurement for impact investment. And one of the key messages that I tried to push there, and I think, you know, have been trying to look at a state in our state as well, is I actually don't believe that the burden for outcomes measurement, so all the way through to long-term outcome impact, should sit with individual enterprises or not-for-profit organizations. I think we have to look at a system level approach to that. And for example, and this is, you know, like just ideas, right? Could we be looking at how we have like the 100 families or a series of really good, robust, longitudinal, university-led or, you know, held informed studies that help us articulate those links between short, medium and long-term outcomes, so that individual organizations and social enterprises only really have to be thinking about, well, how am I demonstrating fidelity to the short-term outcomes, you know, the learning awareness type ones, or how am I demonstrating quality, you know, standards that we've agreed to, and that I'm achieving these kinds of outputs or something. I just think that expecting particularly small community organizations to go all the way through to demonstrating impact is a really hard ask. And I think to Michael's question around what does that mean for, I guess, you know, social impact measurement consultancy, like obviously that means we just have this burgeoning consultancy sector, and I don't think that that's a good idea either. So yeah, how can we balance the needs for smaller organizations to still, you know, meet requirements and needs and make sure we're, you know, doing what we say we do as organizations, but equally that, you know, the system is holding the burden of the really kind of tougher part of doing the outcomes measurement stuff.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question for Aden from a fellow arts person, Rebecca. Do you have any thoughts on the use of culture counts, DCA developed shared measurement framework, versus development of an organisation's own outcomes measurement framework?
Yeah, I love this question. So I want to try and answer it in a way where it's not just me speaking directly to the questioner in a way that bores everyone who's not in the arts. So the arts has something of a shared outcomes measurement framework. In 2014, the WA government put out this report called the Public Value Measurement Framework that connected arts and cultural activities to sort of a shared set of outcomes that were agreed to be important by then the Department of Culture and the Arts. That became codified into a piece of software called Culture Counts, which is now given out freely to organisations that are funded by, I think it's DCA and Australia Council, that allows them to measure their outcomes. It's a good way. So what it's orientated towards as a form of outcomes assessment is to kind of categorize the sorts of works that are being produced by arts and cultural organizations and to help them benchmark them against each other. So it's things like identifying if a particular piece is considered to be, you know, risk-taking or innovative or helping promote cultural diversity or something. And the questions are just sort of, you know, sliding scale, agree, disagree, score of 0 to 100 kind of thing. I think it's an important step forward for the sector. My concerns with it are, and I think it's great that it's something that's sort of standardized and arts and cultural organizations can use to talk to each other. I think it's hard to get enough data. Like you can't use that sort of data to make artistic and programming decisions unless you're operating at a very big scale. So someone like Perth Festival uses culture counts in an incredibly sophisticated way because they're putting on so many events that they can segment them, connect that with their marketing work, figure out what kind of artistic decisions to make in subsequent years. Most organisations using the platform just won't get enough data through it. And the second concern is very geeky, but because I've been talking about epistemic and subjectivity things, I think sitting there and evaluating an artwork objectively, like for example, the assessment of a theatre performance to say it was moving is very different to saying I was moved. If that makes sense? Like the way I think about it is like when you're watching TV and you go, oh, that's so funny, but you don't laugh. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the impact is the laughter, not people saying, oh, that was so funny. And the culture counts mixes this completely up. It doesn't have sort of a consistent, it's not consistently looking at subjective experience, sometimes looking at audience judgment of a work, which I think, I won't go into, but I think is problematic. The other thing I'll just very quickly say about this is I think it's great for the sector talking amongst itself. I think it's done nothing to help the sector as a whole articulate its value to society. So as a measure of public value, a bunch of people going and seeing a Wagner opera and thinking it was really impressive, that actually doesn't translate into any real kind of public value in a way that I can see. And I don't think Culture Counts is really doing anything to advance that argument. So I don't know. I think there's value in doing supplementary work. I'm obviously very biased in that regard. But yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to jump a few questions. There's a question that's just come in that I think is going to be relevant to certainly us in WA. Is social outcome measurement as part of public procurement policy something the WA state government is implementing? And Kylie, this one is aimed again at you.
Yeah, it's hard, like, just to be very clear, I can't speak on behalf of government, right? I can only speak to my experience of working with state government. I think what we have seen is that that was certainly the intent and what we were working towards pre-COVID. I think now we've seen a bunch of the different strategic policy initiatives that would have led to having that happen. So supporting Communities Forum, our priorities, and the outcomes framework to an extent being kind of put to one side for now. So I think certainly it's still the intent, and I think the policy framework exists for that to actually end up happening. How long it takes to do that, given the environment we're in, I don't know.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one more for Jen. Interested in advice regarding the best way to facilitate external validation where an organisation has developed their own outcomes framework or evaluation. Is it as simple as engaging a consultant, or is there anything in particular you should look for, i.e. skill the consultant needs?
So going back to what you're looking for in a consultant, is that what you're asking?
I think the main question is it as simple as engaging a consultant? Or is there anything particularly you should look for?
Yeah, no, I think engaging a consultant in this case, when you are looking for that external validation, would be the way to go. And again, it's going to depend on whoever you choose. It will depend on the experience that they've had and the sort of organisations they've worked with. So obviously you need to do your homework, or as Kylie says, you need to have a good look under the hood when you're engaging somebody for this. Again, I think it's coming back to that reputation and experience would be the most important thing to look for.
Great. Thank you. We're going to end the questions there. Thank you for other questions that have come in, and I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but we will attempt to provide answers to them all. Before we finish, we want to have a quick poll, and so just I'm going to poll has gone inactive. Okay, that's not going to work for us.
Maybe we'll email it as a follow-up.
I think we may have to. That hasn't worked as planned. Okay, so let's leave the poll. What I will ask is if you could, in the chat, leave any comments about the session today. That would be really useful. Anything that you think could be improved, and also anything that you think went well. That would be really useful feedback for us. The other thing that it would be really useful with your comment, if you could give an idea of your level of experience in social impact measurement, just either none, a little, a lot, would be great. And I think that just about wraps it up. So Simon, I'll hand back to you. No. Des, perhaps I'll hand back to you.
Yes, great. I think Simon would just want to say thank you to everyone for participating, and especially to the panel for your advice and support. Also, SIMNA is a vibrant learning network. If you'd like to join us, check it out online, simna.com.au. And yeah, thank you for this first virtual across Australia webinar and chance to learn from everyone. And Simon's back.
Yeah, I am. The tension was building. That was pretty exciting. Thanks, Des. Thanks, Rick. Look, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that came through from the discussion before we do finish right on time. The first is just how broad the discussion was around social impact measurement and how you engage consultants to be able to do it well. It is really broad because the skills that are required to be able to do good social impact measurement touch on the specifics of a sector, as well as specifics around a particular framework or approach that you're considering. So it's just, that's why it probably felt like we were moving through lots of different topics and ideas at the moment. So a lot in there. And we can get quite specific at times as well. That came through really strongly. Three things that I took away was, once again, that magical word trust, building trust. Also the expertise. I consider what type of expertise or approach. It's sort of like dating. It's sort of like dating when you think about finding a social impact measurement consultant support. You're going to be revealing a lot to them over time. So make sure that you're comfortable with their approach and ask good questions to be able to get clear about that. And finally, about transparency. Being clear about how things might be used both for you or from the consultant as well. Thank you, Des and Rick, for being able to facilitate this session today. Thank you very much. And also to our panelists, Kylie, Jen, and Aden. Really appreciate your insights. You know, we are going to be having another one of these sessions very soon, next month for our second webinar. Details will be confirmed soon, but it's likely to be around the SIMNA Awards. Please do sign up to our newsletter. Lots of good information in there. It's pretty rich. As well as consider becoming a member of SIMNA. It's not too much and you can support us greatly. The final thing to raise is, it is a community. We're all sharing and learning. So if you would like to explore some of these questions more, please do get in touch. We're going to work out how to build on the questions that were raised throughout this session. So there's a lot of rich questions in there, but we can definitely do something more with that. Consider writing a blog if you're a member, and we can publish it as well. This is your home too, your community. So thank you, everyone, and for your time today. Have a lovely, what day of the week are we? Today. Have a lovely today. Enjoy today.